Hey, this is Phil Better from the podcast Invest in Yourself, the Digital Entrepreneurs Podcast. Have you ever wanted to be an entrepreneur? Have you heard about all those kids making money on the internet? Do you want to start making money on the internet? Go to investinyourselfpod.com, subscribe, and listen as I interview people who have actually made money online. Listen to me create a business and see if I can succeed. Catch new episodes every Tuesday at investinyourselfpod.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana. My name is Patrick, and with me is my co-host, Mr. Worldwide, checking in for the remix of 2020 into 2021, Mackenzie.
Hey there, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. You?
I'm living my best life right now.
Exactly. Are you actually going to remix 2020 into a better year?
I mean, for myself, maybe. Don't hold out hope for the rest of y'all.
I'm putting all my hopes and dreams on your back, Mackenzie. Just be forewarned.
That ain't no manifest destiny. That's some socialistic bullshit.
That's right. Well, you should know by now that that's pretty much my whole shtick, so I'm not going to apologize for that one.
Your shtick is socialism. Said every Zoomer ever.
Oh, totally. Absolutely. It's the mainstream thing to do right now. Anyway. Yeah. Today, we're going to be talking about a rather central figure in terms of
Nova Scotian politics.
Yes, Nova Scotian politics, but also just like general Nova Scotian culture that's kind of expanded into Canadian culture at large, right?
And definitely a very important figure in Canadian press, Canadian issues of the press. This guy is if you look through the history of Canadian press and freedom of the press and journalism, this guy's going to be a very important figure at the base of it all.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Not to say that he was the instigator of press in Canada, but that he advanced it forward with something that we'll see a bit towards the end of the episode.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to be talking today about a man named Joseph Howe, who lived in the early to second half of the 19th century in Nova Scotia. He has like a career that spans into that spans past Confederation, but today we're mostly going to be talking about his early life up until the 1830s, just because there's already a lot to cover there, and also that's just because where we're at in our overall narrative, and we're going to come back to him later when we talk about the post-Confederation period. Before we get started, though, I always like to remind people that if you want to support the show, you can do so through a variety of ways, including Patreon, if you want some extra episodes hosted by none other than Mackenzie himself.
With Patrick along for the ride.
Yes, I'm still there also. And if you want to get access to early and unedited episodes without any ads, those are going to be there as well. You can also support the show on like a pay what you feel the show is worth through PayPal.
We're just socialists and we want your help.
Yes, exactly.
Lend a hand.
Lend a socialist hand.
But I have one question to ask before we start. How are you doing?
Well, I'm holding out hope for the second half of 2021 because so far this year is starting off already rough here in Quebec.
How do you keep holding on to hope like that? This is going to be the next hour and a half, folks.
To be perfectly honest, I wasn't even thinking about that super obvious pun, but I think we'll just lean into it now. The beginning of every new section should be, how is this doing?
Well, aren't you going to do what you usually do and ask me what I know about him and how I know about him, if I know about him at all?
Well, since you ask the question so boldly, go for it. What do you know about Joseph Howe and how?
So, well, actually, the first I learned of him was actually through the show when we talked about the clockmaker, because he's a figure important in the publication of the clockmaker, sorry, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
He wasn't a writer for it, but he was helped with the publication.
He was the publisher itself.
Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the gist of what I know about him before this episode.
Right. Okay. And yeah, pretty much that's a good place to start because it kind of indicates broadly what the time frame is and what we're going to be talking about today, right? So Joseph Howe was a contemporary of T.C. Haliburton, who was, as you mentioned, the writer for The Clockmaker, right? Which we've done a whole episode on. It was the first episode that Mackenzie showed up on. I think it's episode 16 or 17.
Best episode ever.
Yes, absolutely. But it kind of gives this sense of who Joseph Howe was. So he's this figure who was really prominent starting in the late 1820s, going into the 1830s, and would maintain a prominence as a cultural figure and critic of the government and politics, and really helped not only give a voice to people like Haliburton, who he didn't always agree with, we'll get into Howe's politics after, but wanting to give a voice to local talent. Later on...
You got to respect.
Oh, absolutely, right? I don't agree with Howe himself on many things, but I will give him I will definitely respect, as you say, the fact that he's willing to open up to these new ideas, right? And that's the major difference between him and Haliburton, and one of the reasons why they'll fall out after. And we might get into that, but he was a bit more of a reformer and was still open to these new ideas while working within a British system. But yeah, just this idea, just knowing that he was the publisher of The Clockmaker, this rather politically charged text, really gives you an idea of who he was and what he was all about.
Yeah.
And with that, before we get too deeply into that, I think we should kind of set the groundwork as to who Howe was, how he came into being that kind of figure in Nova Scotia. So his early years were kind of being raised in a rather comfortable family and small family in Nova Scotia. He was born in 1804 in Halifax, and he was greatly influenced by his father, who was known as John Howe, and eventually John Howe Sr., when he would have a son who he would also name John. And John, I mention him only because because he was so influential for Joseph himself. So John was a loyalist who came up from Boston during the American Revolution. And he established basically a printing press in Nova Scotia, as many loyalists did, right? That's one of the things that loyalists brought into Canada, was this great emphasis on printing and information dissemination and education. They were people who had gone through a much more in-depth education than many people had in the British colonies in Canada. So they brought with them this ability to kind of disseminate, and this will to disseminate information and education. Now, John would actually be quite successful in this printing business, and he would namely be the King's Printer, which officially printed royal statutes and official printings in the colonies in this case. And it's at that moment that his already quite impressive business exploded even more, because suddenly he has colonial funding, right? He has royal funding that backs him.
And even more than that, he's got royal influence that backs him. He becomes a central figure. That shield of protection is very key, especially if you're running a journal or a press.
Absolutely. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that he's completely shielded from anything, right?
No.
And I don't think he's trying to be. From what I've read about John, he's a bit more of a conservative. Yes, he's interested in certain change, but he's not the most active proponent of reform. So I don't think that would have been very much a problem for someone like him to be like at risk, right, for any bad information or anything that would go against the official policy of the British government, right? But John himself is mostly known for the publication and being the printer of the monthly Nova Scotia magazine, which was considered to be the first literary journal in Canada. That's a bit debatable, not in the sense that it was a trailblazer, but in the sense that it was a literary journal. A lot of it was reprints of stuff that had already been published. So the definition of the first literary journal in Canada is a bit sketchy, but it's certainly an initial attempt at coalescing all these literary endeavors into a single journal that was sent out to the masses. And that's pretty cool.
I mean, that accomplishment in a colonial period was always going to be impressive, you know? That's
Absolutely.
definitely a marking of progressing to a point that's past just trying to survive, that's really working on moving forwards as a people,
Sure,
as a culture.
absolutely. And that's something that that Nova Scotia could certainly benefit from, and Halifax in particular, because it was a place that had such a long history of people being there and settled, that by the time John and Joseph were working, it was very easy for them to actually go beyond the survival, right? Halifax was a port city with a lot of movement in it at that time. It was a very active city full of these kinds of developments. It's not entirely surprising that this was the first place in Canada to have the first printing press.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just a bit of a basic understanding of John. And I mention him not only because of his influence, but because he would basically bring in his sons, including Joseph eventually, into the printing business. As was most often the case at the time, your sons or sometimes
Carried on the
daughters.
family business.
Exactly, right.
A practice we still see today, honestly.
To some extent. I don't think it's as pervasive as it was before, but it's certainly something that you still see. Yeah. I certainly wouldn't want to continue on in what my father's doing.
Same here.
I don't think I'm cut out to be a marketing consultant.
I'm pretty sure I'm not cut out to be an actuary.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't quite see the link between being an actuary and a literary scholar, but that's a detail.
Yes, we do.
So John would bring in his sons as they got old enough to be able to help him.
Mm-hmm.
And this would not only help his growing business, but it would basically make the Howes, the Howe family, one of the most influential families in Nova Scotia. Because at this point, you had a whole family of people who was in the business of printing information. Right? And so each of their sons, and especially Joseph and sometimes brother-in-laws, would actually have eventually their own printing presses, their own magazines, their own journals. And so you get this really big boost eventually of papers that are owned by the Howe family, right? Which is not an undeniable fact, right? It's quite important to realize that basically by the 1820s, the Howe family would basically produce about 75% of the Halifax trade in terms of printing.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge. So it gives you an idea of how influential they are. So yeah, this does have some downfalls though, because it means that, like many people of the time, Joseph couldn't quite get a formal education or a complete education, right? Because he had to help his father with his business. So at the age of 13, he actually does join up officially with his father, and he works at one of his journals, which is called the Acadian. He works there as an apprentice, learning a bit about the tools of the trade and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And while he doesn't have a formal education as given by the British government or by religious institutions, right? It's around this time that you see the development of public schools. There's still something to be said, I think, about getting an education in the school of life, right? And not only that, but especially as a publisher, you are constantly in contact with different ways of writing, different ideas, and just different ways of working manual labor as a printer, right? So he really does get a complete education, even if it's not as rigid and consistent as a school would offer.
Well, it's also back in this time, the focus was on educating yourself for the profession that you're most likely going to be going in.
Absolutely.
Why would a cobbler need to know Latin?
Well, I think that was the whole drive behind, especially at this time, the idea of getting a public education so that we would all be on the same page. It's not that you don't need to have it, but that it's useful to have it. If you can, why not?
And it's the same with Joseph Howe continued his education. You will see it later when we talk about his poetry. But he had a very worldly perspective. He had a lot of strong base knowledge. You can see in some of his poetry just how much he knows and how much he can talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And, obviously with his print with his newspaper beyond his poetry as well.
No, it's just my point earlier was that it was a common thing for these people to drop out of public education just because they had to go with what they needed to know, just because their quality of life wasn't as high as it is today, where we can afford to not go and take part in education. We don't have to leave school in the summer to go help in the fields anymore.
Exactly. But that's, I think, one of the major things that helped Joseph was because his father didn't necessarily work full time in a field, right? He could still learn some stuff while on the job. So that's certainly something that was useful.
It was a smart mix of practical and classic education.
Oh, yeah. And that's something even beyond working as a publisher. That's something that his father would encourage him to do, is keep reading, right? And so we'll see this a bit later. Joseph has a very firm awareness of what would be called the classics, right? Or at least at the time, what would be called the classics, and to some extent today also. So very much your 16th, 17th, and 18th century British poets, really those writers that were encouraged in the British Empire at the time, right? So you got your Shakespeare, your Daniel Defoe, and so on and so forth. All these classic writers that certainly, I think, permeate in Howe's later writing.
For sure.
So just to cap off this little section on his early years, in 1827, or sometimes I see 1828, I think in 1827 he bought the newspaper known as the Nova Scotian, but in 1828 he officially took over control of it. So in this time, Joseph Howe would be able to officially buy the Nova Scotian from a man named George Rennie Young. He would be the sole owner and editor of this while he was operating with it, which would be for most of his life. And it would soon become, and we'll see why, one of the most influential newspapers in the colony. And that's in no small part aided by the fact that his family was already well established in the publishing industry, but also for various reasons surrounding Howe's life in general that would really push the Nova Scotian to new heights, where other papers that his family has published, like the Acadian and the Nova Scotian Journal, were not quite there.
It also helps that he's very Nova Scotian proud.
Oh, yeah.
This is a man who's not just publishing simply to publish. This is a man who obviously has a passion for what he's publishing, and that's a key part of what you're trying to do. Absolutely.
We can talk a bit about that, but one of the major differences that the Nova Scotian does is exactly that, is it, instead of just reprinting news stories or emphasizing certain British aspects or American aspects, right? America was already like this really big powerhouse at the time. It was encouraging these local ideas much more than his family's predecessors had. And that would certainly help it distinguish itself. Absolutely.
We're about to get to the important stuff.
Hell yeah. So, as I've kind of alluded to throughout this episode so far, Howe was not only just a publisher, but he was a writer and eventually a reformer as well.
Writer is a bit of a stretch. He was a writer, technically.
Exactly.
His libel, which he helped to edit and publish, and then his defense, good. Like his defense won him his case, and that's a good case of writing.
Yeah.
When we read the poetry that he writes, brevity is not his strong suit.
I mean, let's face it. We'll get to it, but even the defense suit was not brief. We'll get to that, but
it's a defense suit. It's not supposed to be brief.
No, that's true.
And again, like his defense. Again, I haven't read this all the way through because super long. But the parts I have read, and when we'll get to the history of it and breaking down the libel defense. But he obviously had some skill, and again, a strong amount of passion, which can take you a long way. But if you have all the technique but no passion, your stuff is just going to be very dull overall.
And that's certainly the case with his poetry. I want to bring up like the fact that he wrote a lot of verse in local newspapers, not only his own. But I do want to bring up this idea that he did write poetry, not because it's particularly good, as we've just touched upon, but because it does give an initial insight into his ideas and how he kind of approached his perception and how he wanted to visualize Nova Scotia, right? Politically, socially, culturally. I think it's an important step to mention. And also,
it's a good way to sum him up. You read his poetry and you can get an immediate idea of what this guy is like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like the entirety of the character of Joseph Howe can be summed up in the 10 lines he wrote of poetry called My Father, which he wrote at the age of 16.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's all right with you, I'm going to do a little recitation.
Yeah, go for it.
This is the only one I'm going to be reciting in full. I tried to recite the other ones out loud earlier today. I went lightheaded and pretty sure I almost passed out.
And also, like, reciting the entirety of the
Acadia.
two we're going to talk about, Acadia and Melville Island, after it would take 7 hours, so we're not going to do that.
But there are some small bits I want to touch on just to point out certain things. But so, My Father, Joseph Howe, age 16, 1821, published in the Weekly Chronicle.
Yeah.
His form, combining health and ease, in features formed by heavens to please, his face is placid, in his mien, meekness and charity are seen. If you could view his polished mind, religion's self is there combined, with grace and truth and manly pride, which to religion are allied. You'd find, if you his life could scan, God's noblest work, an honest man. Very simple set of lines, but you obviously understand exactly who this person is. He very much touches on his father. This whole thing is dedicated just to describing his father. And right away, you already see some of the things he does. There's a lot of repetition here. A lot of use of similar structures, which is fair enough.
Oh, yeah. It's especially for a 16-year-old. I don't think I could have written something as good at 16.
I would have put in too many jokes.
Exactly, right? It shows a certain restraint, but also it's very...
it shows maturity.
Yeah.
There's a certain amount of inspiration going on. Again, it's very descriptive as well.
Mm-hmm. It's trying to really put an emphasis on nostalgia is not the word I'm looking for. It's romantic, right?
Yeah, it's fair again, but that's also fitting for the time, you know?
Yes. Although, yeah, it's fitting for the time, but also I feel he's very much still pulling from these classic influences that he's that his father encouraged in him. And he's certainly not breaking new ground with this poetry, right? And I don't think his point is to.
No, it's not. Again, the point of his poetry isn't to create a new thing of poetry. It's to, again, make Nova Scotia, popular. It's
to bring to light the fact that we're not just like a subpar British colony.
Mm-hmm.
By imitating British poetry.
Yeah. Well, it's almost you take part in the British colony and you become a more integral part of it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you sort of work yourself into saying, like, because you want to be the most influential, or you want to be part of the most influential part, right? You don't just want to be some backwater British colony that Britain just sort of owns to own. You want to make it seem like you're an integral part of the British system, like India was, like the 13 colonies were.
You want to be more than just a port.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. But I think that shines through a bit more in poems like, obviously, Melville Island and Acadia, just because he goes very much more into specific examples, although not quite, of how Nova Scotia develops and how it could be better or worse. Right. But yeah, do you want to talk about that? So we kind of took out two major poems that he wrote. So as we just said, Melville Island and Acadia, which were written, when was Melville Island written? I wrote it down somewhere. Yeah. I don't have it on me right now, but Acadia was written in the 1830s, but was posthumously published in 1873.
It's unfinished, by the way, everybody. The poem is 1,030 lines, and it is unfinished.
Yeah, it's intense. It's kind of like the Alexander McLaughlin poem we read a few episodes ago.
Oh, God. I'm trying to look, because it starts with part first. Oh, there's part second. Okay.
Yeah, it's a really long poem. The point is, it has some interesting ideas in it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to kick this off a bit? Yeah, so just basically the reason why we're bringing these two poems to the forefront is not only because it demonstrates a will by Howe to really present this new culture, or at least try to incite these cultural productions in Nova Scotia, but also because it demonstrates some of his politics. You told me before the show that you had some things to say. Did you want to start by one in particular, kind of flip-flop between both of them?
I can start
if you want.
So, just sort of, again, I touched on a little bit earlier, both these poems you see a very strong inclination to description, lists, and repetition. And I don't mean a list as in, like, whole verses are dedicated to listing out subjects and things and verses. He spends a whole long verse in one of the, where is it? But he spends the entire verse talking about different trees, and each tree gets a line of poetry. Here it is, just after line 110.
In Acadia or Melville Island?
Acadia. This is Acadia.
Okay.
He's talking about the different trees in Acadia, of course.
By the way, before we go on, all these poems are going to be linked to in the description. They're all in the public domain, so you'll be able to read along if you want to read the entire thing, if you're some psychopath who wants to read the entire thing. Anyway, go on.
I'm just going to read a little bit of it because
sure.
I don't want to kill myself.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want my head to run out of oxygen. Fancy near painted to the sun of song, and scenes to which more of nature's charms belong. The towering pines a brighter dress assume, the dark green fir puts on a richer bloom. The maple's purple blossoms now appear, and the birch spreads its verdant leaflets near. The spruce throws off its dark-hued winter dress. The poplar blooms in passing loveliness. The stately hemlock and the spreading beech, their branches over the gentle waters reach, while the oak boughs, which many a storm have braved, in graceful majesty are proudly waved. The bending sumac and the downy palm, the stately ash lend every grove a charm. The alder's tassels wave with every breath. The laurel spread seductive flowers of death. The lethe withe and juniper are seen, waving above the fadeless evergreen, while the sweet fern and aromatic bay shed perfume for the breeze to bear away. And like, that is 20 lines talking about trees. There's a lot to unpack. So he goes through a lot of the four seasons in the first couple hundred lines. And this one is about spring popping up and all the trees starting to come back to life, giving them very humanizing aspects. Again, playing into the pretty romanticism of it all.
Yeah, so there's this idea exactly of this romanticism, the nature. You're really putting emphasis on the pretty aspects of it. But something that I thought was interesting, and I don't think we mentioned it on the show so far, why did you take that accent when you recited the poem?
Oh, because you have to fit, like, if you read his poetry, some of his poetry out loud, some of the lines don't rhyme if they're read the way we'd read them now.
Right.
You have to pronounce them. Even the words, there's a lot of words where, like, letters are replaced, removed, exactly, that sort of thing. So it fits. For example, over, there's no over. There's just over.
Exactly.
Tis spring, stern winter's rain is o'er, and north winds bend our forest groves no more. And it sounds, I don't know, I tried reading it out normally, and then I tried reading it like as it's written, and it sounds better the second way, you know?
Absolutely. I never noticed it. I read it in my regular North American accent. But when you pointed that out, it totally makes sense to me. And it obviously, right, because Joseph Howe wouldn't have necessarily had what we'd consider a North American accent today.
Oh,
right? I don't remember where his father
homogenized
himself came
accent
from.
would have not have existed.
No, not as we know it today, right? Although probably a distinct accent from Europe might have started to develop, or at least certain ways of speaking would have developed, but it wouldn't necessarily be what we have today.
No, for sure. No, so what I'm also talking about is there's in Melville Island at around line 30, there's a new verse that starts. And if you read it normally, it goes, "We crossed the bridge where erst the cannon stood to guard the narrow passage over the flood."
Yeah.
It doesn't match up great. But then, "We crossed the bridge where erst the cannon stood to guard the narrow passage over the flood." You can sort of see how these words would have need to been pronounced.
Exactly.
Or, "We crossed the bridge where erst the cannon stood to guard the narrow passage over the flood." One of those two variations, because he's obviously trying to make these words rhyme.
Or at least have them I rhyme, which is just weird. But I think your version of it works better than just him making an I rhyme out of it. So yeah. As in IYE, by the way, for listeners who can't necessarily see what I'm talking about. But yeah.
And you see it. There's a couple more instances where, like, again becomes again. For example, I sigh, sleep deep, and you can tell he's trying to make this rhyme. Like, you go down, and it's just a set of rhyming couplets constantly. Mm-hmm. It's kind of disconcerting how many words he found to rhyme everything with. But it's also, when you're reading it out loud, different words and letters take on different sounds just because it fits this rhythm that you start to pick up as you go.
Mm-hmm. And it was meant to be read out loud, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of we've kind of lost that today, this idea, but a lot of poetry was written with the intent of being read out loud at the time.
Oh, for sure.
So that's definitely something that I think is important to bring up. And also, this is something that, if we want to stay on to the idea of form, right, there's, I think, something that is interesting going on, right? So we've talked about it's being rather flowery in the way that he speaks, and it's long periods of time where he just describes the beauty of Nova Scotia. But I think there's something that a critic had mentioned. I think it was Desmond Pacey. I was reading up on his criticism of Joseph Howe. Desmond Pacey was an old English professor in the 50s and 60s. He was rather well known. But he had mentioned basically that in Acadia, it's interesting that the reading of it, or the form, kind of speeds up with the action. He still manages to speed up. For example, there's a massacre that's brought out by Native Americans, and it slows down when he's more moralizing in tone. Mm-hmm. Right? So there is an awareness by Howe of this kind of formatting, which I think is very interesting. So he is trying to do something beyond just expressing a simple message, right? He's actually using the form to a certain effect. And I think that comes back to what we were saying about it being spoken out loud, because it would have been read a bit faster, and you would have had this sense that something important or a bit more action-oriented was happening, right? Which I thought was very interesting. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention about the form in and of itself?
Again, it fits his rambling nature.
Yeah.
These poems, like, they go on, like, poetry is supposed to be this long descriptive form, but you read this and there's definitely a sort of rambling quality to it, where he's constantly speaking. And again, this rhythm that develops as you go through it. I was reading this out loud to myself, and it got easier as I went, because you start to pick up on this rhythm as he starts to pick up and become more comfortable with what he's writing and what he's trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
And again, his worldly perspective shines through. In Acadia, it's around the second verse, and he goes through and he starts naming all these places where that to sort of compare to Acadia, and it's all about where God's grace will land, where the light of God will be. And he's not naming, like, well-known places. Yes, there's a feeling that from pole to one dear spot still fondly links the soul. Exiled from home, Foscari pined and died, and as the Hebrew by Euphrates' side thought of the scenes that blessed his childish hours, cannons, verdant groves, and rosy bowers, the founts of feeling filled in other years, poured over his wasted cheek a flood of tears. The wandering Swiss, as through the world he roves, sighs to behold the alpine land he loves. And even the Lapland's rude, untutored child, with icy pinnacles around him piled, slumbers in peace upon his lichens grey, though the gaunt wolf howls round him for his prey. And it goes on for a while where it starts talking about all these places. And do you know what home Foscari is? Because I had to Google it when I heard it.
I did not Google it. There's another part of this specific section that I want to bring up, but go ahead. What is it?
It's a home. It was the Doge's home of Francesco Foscari in Venice.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, you're not going to know that unless you're well educated and had this wide view. I'm well educated. I didn't know what home Foscari was.
No, absolutely not.
Even Lapland, if it's the Lapland I'm thinking about. You keep going with what you were going to do.
No, I was just going to say, in this case, for the Foscari, home Foscari, like, it kind of fits with his classical education that that we mentioned, but I think that's something that's kind of been lost to our common education at this point, not focusing on Italian Renaissance writers or painters or whatever. But the thing I wanted to mention, and this kind of brings us into the themes of these two poems, more than anything else, more than the form. And we can come back to the form if you have other stuff to say. But
he calls Acadia the Pearl of the West.
Yes, that. And I think
British
that
Columbians beware.
Exactly. No, but I think what I was going to mention, right? He mentions a lot of religious symbolism, and as the Hebrew, and by the Euphrates side, the Euphrates, this powerful river in Mesopotamia, right? Or not Mesopotamia today, but that region, right? It's these centers of empires and these centers of great civilization. It really brings to light, not only with the religious aspect, the moral high ground that he wants Nova Scotia to have within the British Empire, but also, as we mentioned before, the kind of geographic center that he wants it to have within that empire, right? By mentioning the Euphrates. It's something that is really at his forefront, and that I think permeates a lot also in Melville's Island. So, for example, right, a lot of Melville Island suggests, I wrote this down, it kind of suggests that Nova Scotia shouldn't be considered this remote place or isolated from mainstream human civilization as he understood it. Right? It's this place that has the ability to grow and should be encouraged to grow, right? And so that it wasn't just this backwater place.
Right.
And you see this followed up in Acadia, where while it is rather vague in its descriptions, or at least it tries to be as broad as possible with descriptions of nature and stuff like that, it does demonstrate his desire to have a much brighter social and economic future, and political to some extent future, for the people of Nova Scotia. Right? I think one of the ways that he does that, and this kind of comes back to the form of the poem, is that throughout the poem, he does mention certain things as being negative, or at least a lack of history and stuff like that. But I think that part of the reason that he does this is not to say that this is not a place that's interesting. It's on the contrary, it's to bring attention to the fact that it's considered that way, but it shouldn't be, right? And that it's up to the people of Nova Scotia and the British Empire to recognize that there is the possibility of that remarkable history and being a remarkable people.
Again, a man of his people, a man of his passion.
To kind of sum that all up, what I just said, this was one of his biographers who mentioned this, Murray Beck, who wrote a lot on Joseph Howe. It was him who had written you'll never or rarely see in Joseph Howe writing him attacking a specific party, right? Or blaming a specific person for a situation, because he wasn't interested in like factionalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or putting the blame on a specific entity. While he recognized that certain entities did have certain things wrong with them, and he wasn't above criticizing them, he was more interested not in what a specific person could do, but what Nova Scotia could become, right? Beck put it in the sense of Howe was more interested in the party of Nova Scotia rather than the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party. While he was very much interested in these British traditions that he expounds not only in the form of Acadia and Melville Island, right? He's very much still interested in how the British wrote poetry and British institutions of government. Howe was interested in what they could do specifically for Nova Scotia and how that could be adapted and reformed for Nova Scotia. So that's why he's
not
often
what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
pretty much, right? Bit more than 100 years before that. Yeah, it's exactly that. You'll often see descriptions of Howe like that, not that he used for the party of Nova Scotia, and that he was a conservative reformer, right? Or a liberal progressive conservative, if you want to put it in more like modern terms. You know, that's basically the gist of what we're going for, not only with the poetry, but as a character description of the man.
Mm-hmm. He's interested in what the poetry can do for Nova Scotia. He isn't interested in the form of poetry itself.
Yes.
It's a medium for a message to him.
Absolutely. Do you think...
Because he knew that posting papers and all these other things will only get him so far.
Mm-hmm.
He's balancing entertainment with trying to educate.
Do you think that this would be successful, right? If you were someone, like, I understand it's kind of hard to kind of place ourselves in 1830s Nova Scotia. But
if I was an 1830s Nova Scotian.
Right. Reading this, right? Reading Acadia or Melville's Island, right? Reading these things that, you know, where does the sun its richest radiance shed? Where is the choicest gift of nature spread? Right? All these rhetorical questions about Nova Scotia.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that it would be successful in convincing you that Nova Scotia is something that could be better, right? Or do you think it's a bit too empty, a bit too vague?
No. I think it conveys that idea well enough. Well, whether or not people listen, it's hard for me to say, just because their notions of bias, education would have been so vastly different from my own based on that time.
For sure.
Again, these people back then, as uneducated as they are, would have been more prone to fall for things like propaganda and self-aggrandizing, especially when presented to them in the form of poetry, which is seen as the highest of the artistic forms.
Yeah.
So I think it definitely would have stirred something in them. They just wouldn't have known what it was.
Right. I'll agree with that. From my personal end, and this kind of comes back to Halliburton, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the type of writing that Halliburton was writing would have been a bit more effective.
Oh, for sure.
Right. Not to really compare, right? Where it's comparing novels with poetry. It's two different types of writing with two different ways of expounding a message.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of convincing a people that you need to change, right? Or that there is the possibility for change and that something's wrong with the society that you're living in or that it could be better. Personally, from my end, I think it's more effective just because you have clearer characters, you have clearer ideas, rather than just these vague notions that Howe doesn't really develop on.
Right.
You know, as you mentioned, these are poems that are hundreds of lines long, even thousands of lines long. And how much can you actually say that is very clear about his thought about where Nova Scotia should go?
Right.
That's not to say that in his personal life, Howe didn't have clear ideas. There were certain clear ideas, and we'll get into what they were later. I just don't think that they're very clearly explicated in his poetry. That's just me. That's just my analysis of it. Anything else?
About Howe and his poetry?
Yeah, sure.
How did he keep writing it?
Well, evidently he didn't, since Acadia
No.
was published posthumously, right? It was at some point he either stopped or just couldn't ever find a way to finish it. So evidently he didn't keep writing it.
Yeah, but I definitely see a lot of similarity between him and McGill-Queen.
Yes.
They write similar ways. They write with a similar message in mind. This idea of aggrandizing through the use of flowery, descriptive, poetic, or romantic pieces.
Yeah. It's
Pretty poetic pieces. There's one for you.
It's interesting to me. So McGill-Queen was writing in the 1860s, so about 60 years after Howe is like in this period in his career, or at least writing this poetry, even if it was published after. It's interesting to me that poetry didn't develop that much further in the colonies.
I also think it's a sign of how behind the times McGill-Queen was.
Yeah.
Like
Absolutely.
that's more a statement on McGill-Queen, how slow he is and how behind he was, more than the development of poetry.
Yeah.
Just to dunk on him a bit more.
Oh, sure. You dunk on McGill-Queen all you want. But also, this is not like an entirely original idea from my end. Like, I've seen many critics talk about this very same problem in Canadian letters up until like the Confederation poets, right? In the 1880s and 90s. You'll still see this type of writing up until then. And these are poets that are considered to be like, quote unquote, homegrown Canadian poets that were actively trying to move away from the British model, and they were still writing in this style. Like, it's a style that lasted for a long time, this very romantic and flowery prose.
For sure.
So I just find that absolutely fascinating.
Homegrown.
Yeah, it is the first term that came to mind, but whatever.
Cool.
So how about we take a little break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking a bit more about the journalism and a trial that Howe was a part of, and kind of see how those two types of writing, or how the journalism and the poetry kind of differed for Howe, right? And see if we can get a better sense of his ideas from it.
Fine, if we have to.
I mean, you don't have to participate in this part if you just want to
No,
leave.
I want to participate.
I can monologue forever.
I want to participate.
Okay. All right, let's take a quick break. We'll see you in a few minutes. And we are back. So, as we mentioned before the break, so Joseph Howe owned many journals, and he didn't write just poetry or encourage local poets and writers. He was also a journalist in his own right. And to many critics, including myself from what little of his journalism I've read, I think it was a bit more of a potent vehicle for his ideas. So while there were some good elements to his poetry, and you certainly see the inkling of some of the ideas that he was going for, I think the journalism is where he shines.
Oh, for sure. He was a publisher, not a writer. He was a publisher.
He's best known in his work for what was called ramblings. That's something that you mentioned, Mackenzie, that's how his poetry kind of reads.
Rambling?
Not entirely surprising, right? He had an entire section in his paper in the Nova Scotian called Ramblings.
That makes sense. That doesn't surprise.
There was a series called Ramblings in the East and Ramblings in the West.
Ramblings in the East and Ramblings in the West.
The entire goal of these ramblings was basically Howe would go around Nova Scotia in different areas of it and talk to people, get their views on stuff. So I think this is very interesting. That was one of the major elements of his journalism, was actually talking to the people with whom like these politics and these actual social issues had an impact on, right? He wasn't necessarily talking directly to the councilman or the prime minister or whatever. Like, there was no prime minister at the time, but you get my idea. He was interested in talking to the so-called common people. And that's something that he took pride in. That's not to say that that's the only thing that he did. He would still do like many news publishers and publish stories from the rest of Canada or the Canadas, right? Upper and Lower Canada. He would publish stuff from the United States, from Britain. So there, you still had this wide range of ideas. But this idea of actually interviewing and talking to people that lived through these experiences, I think, is a very interesting one. And
Sure.
I pulled up a quick snippet of one of the letters that he wrote to someone called Susan Ann, which gives a sense of a bit more of his writing, his regular writing, how the ramblings sounded, and his non-poetic works. Right. So I'll just read this little section. This would have been written rather in 1834. Quote, "You would be astonished to see how the poor settlers in the country live, and how they do without the great indispensable agent of the towns, money, butter, grains, cattle, potatoes. And where they live near brooks and rivers, logs are their common mediums.
All
It may
right.
depend I borrow some lessons of content from these people, some inducements to perseverance and activity in a walk of life more laborious to the mind perhaps, although that I doubt, but certainly not so harassing to the body." Now this is obviously just one snippet, but do you see what I mean when I say that his journalism is a bit more potent than his poetry?
Just a little bit. It's
Yeah,
fine.
right? It's a bit more direct. He's clearly identifying certain elements that are lacking or could be better, and certain elements that are good, right? He has a clear vision.
Right.
This is something that already indicates a bit more of his progressive side, but also some of the British conservative elements that definitely permeate into most of Nova Scotian society, or at least the higher Nova Scotian society, and that we talked about a bit when we talked about the Petworth immigration scheme. He talks about how poor some of the settlers are and how they managed to do with little. So they're very ingenious people who can survive with minimal resources.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something about the writing, right, that, or at least certainly at the end, that definitely gives a sense that he's encouraging this type of mentality that's like, well, you actually have to work hard and you'll make it. Right? Which is not always the case, right? As we know today, or as
All the time.
some people know, it's still an idea that you see a lot, is that, well, people are just lazy if they don't work hard and make it, right? Which is not quite always the case.
That's not entirely true.
Right.
Slightly true.
No, but you understand what I mean, right? You still see these little conservative elements, and maybe it's right. I don't know much about the people that he's talking about, obviously their personal
Right.
lives or anything, but this perception still remains.
Different time period, different values as well. Like this is over 200 years ago by this point. Or just,
Yeah.
no, just about 200 years ago.
Just almost, yeah. That's insane. Oh my God, 200 years ago. What a legend.
And we're going to be in this time period for a while now, if I remember correctly.
Well, next episode we're going to be talking about like the 18th century more. So we're going to go back in time, but pretty soon we're actually going to head into the 1840s. So that's not true.
How long have we been in the 1820s, 1830s?
I mean, there's a lot of important stuff that happened in this period. Like, it's not my fault that so much happened in the 1830s and 20s in Canada.
I think you're a little biased because this is the time period that you as a historian study, but okay.
Look. If you look at the episode list, you'll see that there's a lot in the other periods also. Like, I am taking my time with this show, and I feel no shame with this.
Okay, keep plugging your thesis. Go ahead.
But no, this was just to show like the balance that he has between progressive ideas, progressive politics, and conservatism. Now, his more progressive ideals and his reform ideals would get increasingly, he would emphasize those ideals more and more as the years went on. Part of it was because of certain elements being added to the British North American colonies, like Durham's report at the end of the 1830s, which he would entirely agree with, right? So this, or at least progressive for the time, by the way, these types of progressive politics he would be attracted to, right? And this will to reform he would be attracted to.
Right.
But the seeds of that of these more progressive elements would definitely be had and be seen in Joseph Howe throughout the 1830s, right? Long before Durham wrote his report, his famous report, which we made a whole episode about, and you can check out in previous episodes.
Or don't, because it's Durham.
Check out the episode if you want to hear us lambast him. But
God.
I think it's important also to give a little bit of context about what Nova Scotia politically, outside of Joseph Howe, was looking like in the 1830s.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not quite the same as what we've been talking about in Upper and Lower Canada. Namely, the fact that it was a bit less democratic. A lot of if you look at like a generalized history of Nova Scotia, you'll see that it's a place that was the first to get responsible government in the 1840s, and that they did so without active revolution, right? As you'd see in Lower Canada and Upper Canada. But for the longest time, it didn't even have, until 1837, if I remember correctly, it didn't even have massive bodies of elected officials as the Canadas had, right?
Right.
A lot of them were just people that were chosen by the Governor General of the province, right? And this was something similar that you saw not only in the councils, right, but on a legislative level as well, right? So the judges and the magistrates and people like that were pretty much all chosen by aristocratic friends and people in higher positions.
The way it should be, obviously.
Naturally, right? I don't see any other possible solution to this.
The people, what do they know?
That's not to say that there couldn't be some good that could come from this system, but it didn't, right? In the 1830s, like, Nova Scotia was really on a downward spiral. It was well known that the councils of all shapes and sizes, like the juries and the councils, were pretty much just making themselves richer. Right? They were using the little people, unsurprisingly, to just exploit the crap out of them and not really care.
Are they not supposed to do that?
Look, I would have thought so, but apparently not. Right? And people got really pissy about it.
Losers.
Right? But yeah, they basically used their positions in governments, and this is me condensing it down greatly, to make them, to line their pockets and to basically help themselves have an easier life by really exploiting the lower class. You can see this, for example, during the 1820s and 30s, there was a single bank in Nova Scotia, the Bank of Nova Scotia. Very original name, right? And a lot of the people who were shareholders in this bank and who had a vested interest in the success of this bank also happened to be councillors in Nova Scotia. A complete coincidence, obviously.
Totally.
But what you saw is that there was a constant delay in the creation of a second bank in Nova Scotia, right? So that would obviously share some of the profits, or at least pass it out. It would create less of a monopoly, but it would also make that these councillors who had as I said, a rather massive interest in the success of the Bank of Nova Scotia would be slightly less rich. And they couldn't have that. So they were constantly delaying the creation of a new bank. Right? The problem is that kind of screws with the economy. Surprise, surprise again, right? It didn't create an economy that could particularly thrive well. It didn't create a system in which people trusted the government in which they were in. So all kinds of problems were being had in Nova Scotia. And Joseph Howe did not kind of shy away from calling it out as it was, right? He personally reported on all these activities, or lack thereof, or lack of like legislative activity. And he made editorial comments about them that were widely read, right? Because the Nova Scotian was a very popular journal. So he made it a personal duty to make sure that people knew of this. The problem with this is not the fact that he was trying. Well, actually, yeah, it kind of was, because people in power were not very happy about this, right? And it's important to remember that laws concerning libel and concerning concerning freedom of speech were not as developed as they were today, or at least as they are today in Canada. So it's very easy for people in power, like the council, kind of very quickly shoo people away who did not who did not conform to their beliefs, right?
Right.
And one of the ways that they could do that is by just claiming that whatever was published was libelous, right? Which means that it was false. It was false print. This would directly affect Joseph Howe in 1835, which would publish a letter, which was signed anonymously at the time by just someone signing "The People," right? Which is a great move, by the way, just calling yourself "The People" in terms of marketing. It's great. You're like, yes, this represents us. But we know now who that person was. It's a friend of Joseph Howe's called George Thompson, who wrote this piece.
Okay.
Basically, this is a letter that was published in the Nova Scotian on the 1st of January, 1835, that wrote basically this accusation against the magistrates, so members of the legislative branch of Nova Scotia, and the police, right? So this is an attack against basically the system, directly attacking the system of government of Nova Scotia. And it reads a bit like this. From the pockets of the poor and distressed, at least 1,000 pounds is drawn annually, and pocketed by men whose services the country might well spare. And that, quote, during the lapse of the last 30 years, the magistracy and police have, by one stratagem or another, taken from the pockets of the people, in over exactions, fines, etc., etc., a sum that would exceed in the gross amount of 30,000 pounds. Now, this was just a part of the letter, but you can read the full of it in the description, right? I'll put a link. It's published in full by the Nova Scotia legislature today on their website. Basically, it's calling out corruption, right, and fraud.
As one does.
Right, as you should. But it was not taken for granted at the time. Right? This is why we're bringing it up today, is because this is an important step in terms of journalism, because people were afraid of doing such a thing, because you could just slap a libel suit on it. In essence, George Thompson, and by extension, Joseph Howe, were saying, look, these people are doing whatever they want and just benefiting from it. And that's bullshit. After the publication of this letter, there were basically two options for the magistrates. They could either ignore it and be judged in the court of public opinion, which they would be because of the wide distribution of the Nova Scotian, or they could prosecute Howe for libel, not only spend time, resources, but maybe risk failure, but the chances of that is minimal. So basically, they chose the latter, right? They chose to sue for libel. This is going to be like the last part that we're going to talk about.
The most important part, though.
The most important part. So Howe would be taken to court.
For basically saying, y'all are corrupt.
Exactly. That's exactly what happened. Howe was like, this is crap. And they were like, yes,
no, but
not. Also, you have no proof. And we can just shut you up. So that's what we're going to do.
And this is where Howe proves how smart he is.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
With how he argues this. So, because his argument isn't based on defending himself from the libel. Everybody knows the libel's from him, published by him, blah, blah, blah. But his argument was, I should be allowed to say what I want. If I'm not allowed to say what I want, what's even the point? You know, and it's a smart move because in the minds of the people in power, just being allowed to say what you want isn't a big deal. It doesn't actually put him in power.
Yes.
But freedom of speech and freedom of the press is so important.
Exactly.
If you've learned anything from the era that we live in now about the information, freedom of the press is a key part of it.
Well, you said Howe defended himself because he had to, right? He couldn't find a lawyer who would back him in this.
Right.
This is the world we live in. Like, I cannot stress this enough. Nobody would touch this case or to defend Howe with a 10-foot pole. Because they were all like, this is a fool's errand. You literally just accused the justice system, and now you're going to go to court against that justice system, which has all the power, right? So what are you even doing, man? And so he had to basically learn on the spot how to be a lawyer and how to defend himself, which is insane. One of the things that helped him, and we'll get to that, is the fact that he was such a great speaker, right? You just mentioned that. But also that he was facing off against a jury, right? A jury of his peers, right? So they were the ones that ultimately were going to judge him, right? Not the magistrates, which makes a huge difference. If it was just the magistrates, they probably would have just said, no, you're going away, right? You're going to have to pay whatever fine, you're going to go to prison, whatever it is. But at least he's working somewhat on equal footing in trying to convince his peers. But also, he had a fantastic defense stacked up, and written out for him.
This is where he shines.
Basically, the people who are accusing him, the prosecution, all they do in prosecuting him is read out the libelous letter. That's all. That's their whole statement, if you will, is to read the letter and say, this is nonsense. Thus ends the prosecution. Howe counters with a 6-hour speech, which we're not going to read out here, but again, you can find for free online. But it is meticulous. Point by point, he goes over everything that's said in the letter, and he basically destroys every single one of the arguments and backs it up with proof, and goes above and beyond this idea by giving example after example of all kinds of places where the magistrates and the councils failed the people and failed their colony, and failed the British system of democracy that they claimed to uphold. Howe leaves no doubt in anyone's mind, not only that he knows what he's talking about, but that even if what he said was wrong factually, there's plenty of other cases in which he was right. So it's, I think, a really great way to go about it. Some of us might think, good Lord, 6 hours, right? Who speaks for 6 hours? This is insane. What do you even say? How do you even go about it?
That's just what politicians did.
Exactly. Right? It was a different way of just acting out. And this is where his poetic sensibilities come back out, because it's very flowery and extended, what he writes. But, it's just, I think it's not that he didn't know how to edit himself. I think he just had a lot to say, and he used his moment in the spotlight to get out as much as possible.
Right. So
that even if he was found guilty by the jury, he could at least say that he tried.
Right.
And so that gives for a 6-hour speech, but it's a great way of getting heard, right? So I kind of singled out a moment that I think is important, and that kind of sums up that 6 hours, what he's arguing for, right? Because as you mentioned, he's not arguing for the libel, right?
No.
And this quote comes towards the end. He says, "Yes, gentlemen, come what will, while I live, Nova Scotia shall have the blessing of an open and unshackled press."
Damn.
Right. I really like the addition of "while I live." It
puts a lot of importance on him.
Yes, but it's his life mission, right?
Yeah.
He sees the importance of newspapers, right? Of the news.
Which are kind of important, all things considered.
Yes, right. We all should. I'm just saying, that's what he's focusing on. Not the factuality of it. The importance of being able to say it. I don't know if you read the libel defense.
Not the defense. I read a bit of the libelous letter itself, but boy.
Yeah.
Even looking at the first couple of paragraphs.
Oh yeah, it's destructive. It's just so vehement. I love it.
And it's just, I love the spite of it all. Presenting this super sound argument and everything, denouncing every one of your opponent's points and then going, but people, that's not the important part. That is a powerful statement to say all this time you just spent and then going, my defense isn't what's important right now. What's important is our freedom to say as we like.
Absolutely.
That's some big energy right there.
Oh yeah. Right. But it's more important, right? It's not just that we can say what we like. We here is the common people, right? Because the magistrates could say what they want, right? The council can say what they want. We, like, to use a modern term, right, the 99% or whatever, we can't say what we want.
No.
And so
Saying what we want.
that goes against British democracy, right? Which Howe really truly believed in.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And he just wanted to make sure that it was understood and properly established. I don't know. Did you see what the outcome of the trial was?
Didn't it? Wait, let me take a look at my notes.
Okay. You're just going to cheat, aren't you?
It's okay. Calm yourself. I didn't know I was going to be quizzed.
Yeah,
he wasn't guilty, right? He was found not guilty in 10 minutes, was it?
Yeah, exactly. So the trial lasted 2 days, and the jury deliberated for 10 minutes, and they were like, nah, this guy's cool.
And like, nobody else believed he had a case. So he stood up for him. Why isn't there a movie about this?
Right. Okay. Yes. Like, I want at least a 5-part movie series on Howe.
I can just imagine the monologue, like reading out part of it as part of the big scene, you know? I mean, you're not going to read the whole damn thing, but...
No, make the entire movie just him reading the monologue.
Well, I mean, it'd be better off being a 10-part series at that point.
You're right.
One part just being libel defense. I mean, it'd be a new form of media, doing a one long monologue for that long.
Yeah,
kind of like what BoJack Horseman did.
Yep.
But
who would play Joseph Howe, though?
Oh God, what does he look like?
He looks like every other middle-aged white dude from the 1830s.
God, I don't know. Ewan McGregor?
Yeah, sure.
Gary Oldman?
That could work. I'd take a Ewan McGregor-led Joseph Howe movie in an instant.
I'd like if it was a Canadian actor, though.
For sure. But do you know like any Canadian actors off the top of your head? Okay.
The only Canadian actors I know are comedians.
Right. So it's going to be played by
Jim Carrey.
I would love that.
Oh, Ryan Gosling.
Ooh, put him in old person makeup. That'd be kind of fun. The point is, it would make for a fascinating movie. Absolutely.
Kiefer Sutherland. Oh, didn't know he was Canadian. All right, Don Sutherland, Kiefer Sutherland. Sorry, back on track.
Just to kind of cap this off. So once he was acquitted, right? So once
after a 6-hour speech, folks,
proof that you should know how to speak in front of a crowd, right? Because
at that
it might
point,
get
it's
you
also
out of a libel defense.
It's also just an endurance test because if this was a court, he'd probably be standing for 6 hours doing nothing but talking. No break for food, water, no potty breaks, nothing. I doubt it. If he was delivering the defense he had to deliver to make himself seen as not guilty in 10 minutes, he would have been standing there and talking for 6 hours. Nothing else.
It's kind of baffling in reading a lot about like these 19th century figures and stuff like that. It's kind of impressive how often that shows up, this idea that people spoke for just 3, 4, 5 hours in a row. It was
just got to keep talking.
Oh yeah, it was really like an Iron Man of political speeching.
We have the filibuster.
In the aftermath of this, basically not only would several magistrates resign because they were like, oh crap, now like this guy set a precedent, right? Or at least the equivalent of this guy set a precedent. But a lot of them refused to be appointed to the post. Right? So it completely shifts a bit of the established aristocracy of Nova Scotia at the time. And not long after, there would actually be a bit more of a democratic form of government that would be installed, right? There would be some voting, although not quite responsible government levels of voting. It's pretty much acknowledged that with this, Joseph Howe starts, and his libel suit kind of set the standard for the principle of free press in Canada. Finally, this is pretty much, and this is where we'll pick up later, not in the next episode, but later in Joseph Howe's life, this will pretty much lead to his political career proper. Where before he was like a political commentator for his newspaper, he would full on become a politician for the Liberal Party, or the Reform Party as it was known at times.
Mhm.
And pretty much that's what he'll make a career out of for the rest of his life. And he'll be a very active politician in Nova Scotia and eventually on a completely federal level, right? He'll be a thorn in John A. Macdonald's side for quite some time, but he was a very important figure politically. So he'll continue to have an influence in the country, which I think is cool. And also he'll be like one of the leading figures for actual responsible government in Nova Scotia.
Also
But
pretty cool.
We'll get to that. So like all kinds of threads that we left open, but I think we've spoken for like an hour and a half at this point. We did a good thing by stopping at the libel trial.
And that's it's an important thing to finish on that, because that's one of the most important, especially for like Canadian journalism and just all that. That's the kind of thing that sets precedent, you know?
Yes. We talked a bit already about how Halliburton and how Howe were approached their views on society differently and stuff like that. But
Society.
right, like Halliburton was much more conservative than Howe, as we've already discussed. And he kind of faded into obscurity by the end of his life, right? He didn't adapt with the times.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that Howe very much embodied was evolving with the times, despite these conservative elements. But there's kind of a debate as to culturally whether he's more of a provincial figure or a national figure, as we'd understand it today, like a Canadian figure.
Mm-hmm.
Based on what you know about like Canadian society today, or even just Nova Scotian society, do you think that this is a valid argument? Where would you stand on this? Would you consider him more of a provincial figure that really helped Nova Scotia, or would you consider him to be someone who really transcends just Nova Scotia?
It depends where you're looking and how you're looking at him. If you're looking at just his poetry and maybe him as a publisher, I'd say he's more provincial, a figure of Nova Scotian provinciality. But if you're considering that lawsuit and what it stood for, I think that goes a bit more into Canada.
Yeah, I'll definitely agree with that. Like, culturally speaking, that it was provincial more than anything else.
Yeah, everything else, most of his publishing and all that was provincial, but that one case that shoots him up a bit.
Was there anything else that you wanted to mention before we kind of put an end to the episode?
No, I think we summed it up.
Cool.
I think people should try and give the libelous writer, the libel defense indictment, just a bit of a read, a cursory glance over at most.
Yes.
Like, that's all I did, so I want to ask people to do more.
I mean, if you want to, go ahead.
Because it's an important thing, and it's a moment that's very much overlooked. I think people underestimate the power of precedent, the power of doing something just because it's the thing that came before.
It seems like such a product of its time in a sense.
Right.
Of like, I don't know how easy it would be to conduct something on this scale today, right?
That's true.
I think part of it comes from the fact that there were relatively little like voices, right? With the advent of the internet and the huge democratization of abilities to speak on so many platforms, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of attention was given to Howe at the time because there was a bit more of a lack of these kinds of things, right? There were other newspapers, obviously, with varying opinions of all kinds of things in Nova Scotia and Canada and the United States. But I don't think you could have something on that level today, right? Just because it stood out so much among a relatively small pool that you can't help but concentrate on it.
Oh, for sure. And just, it's not something that would pop up today.
No.
I don't see anybody giving that 6-hour speech. People really think about that. 6 hours, just talking, no breaks. He might have had an interruption or two to have a glass of water. That's it.
That's longer than some shifts at work. Like, spend a whole day at work speaking about like politics.
And standing, no leaning.
Naturally.
No leaning on the desk. No, just you're there in an uncomfortable courtroom clothes. Like, this isn't your relaxed home clothes either.
And we didn't really talk about this, but he's like 25 at this point. Like, that's super impressive to do at the time.
Like,
He's 30.
Jesus.
That's not true.
Mad respect to the man.
Yeah, like good on him. Anyway, I think that's as good a place as any to end the episode.
I think people get it.
Mad respect for the dude.
I don't agree with him, but I respect him.
What specifically do you not agree with?
Conservatism in general.
Yeah, that's cool. Anyway,
that's not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That's what.
Yeah, exactly. Let's end on that.
Let's end on John F. Kennedy and a Canadian podcast. Sounds great.
Sure.
If that doesn't sum up Canadian culture, I don't know what does.
That's brutally honest, but
I'm sorry, disputing it?
No.
There you go.
I'm just going to say thank you, everyone, for listening to this.
You can reach out with any questions, comments, or concerns on the Facebook page, through Twitter, and by email. All links are in the description.
You've got it down, Pat, man.
Thanks.
Again, if you want to support the show, there are all kinds of ways you can do it. If you want to hear more of us, or if you want to offer it as a gift, that's always really cool. You can get extra episodes for as little as $3 a month, which is less than a coffee at Starbucks. So that's pretty cool.
Or Timmy's if you want to be Canadian about it.
If you want to reach out with questions, by the way, I didn't mention this at the top of the episode, but during our little break that we took during the holidays, we got a series of questions by a listener, and it is so cool. I plan on touching upon them probably starting next episode, because she does lead up to a lot, but she has like 10 questions that she gave out, and they are great. So honestly, I go through the emails and I respond to every one of them. So,
and we discussed them. It's not just him. I'm part of this too.
Yes, but I don't think anyway. It doesn't matter. Yes, Mackenzie could also answer the emails. The point is, send in questions, and we'll answer them. We'll feature them on the show. We love them, and yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I guess we'll see you all in 2 weeks, or next week if you're a listener of Pop Canada on Patreon, because we're going to record that soon. And yeah, I guess we'll see you all next time. Bye. Cheers, everyone.